We are back in topic 4.3. We are actually going to skip explain 2 this year in the interest of time. We're going to go all the way down to explain 3 right there. We're going to talk about defining imaginary numbers. So this is something that should be completely brand new to you. You've never seen this before. So you know that the quadratic equation x squared equals 1 has 2 real solutions. The equation x squared equals 0 has 1 real solution. And the equation x squared equals -1 has no real solutions. By creating a new type of number called imaginary numbers, mathematicians allowed for solutions like x squared equals -1. So an imaginary number is going to allow us to solve something where we take the square root of it and it has a negative underneath the radical sign. So we have been lying to you for years that that's not possible. Imaginary numbers are the square roots of negative numbers. So that's important. They're the square roots of negative numbers. These numbers can be written in the form bi, where b is the non-zero number, I is the imaginary unit, and represents -1. Some examples of imaginary numbers are as follows. So there's something here that we need to put a little note on the outside here. It just told us that I squared is equal to it told us that I is equal to the square root of -1, which means that I squared is equal to -1. So these two things are going to be super important as we're doing problems. We can substitute in for them, okay? So given that I equals the square root of -1, you can conclude that I squared equals -1. This means that the square of any imaginary number as a negative real number is a negative real number. When squaring an imaginary number, use the power of product property of exponents. So basically, we can use, even though it's an imaginary number, we can use our exponent properties on it. So looking at this first one, it says find the square of the imaginary number. So I am supposed to square the number, which means I am going to distribute that in, which means I've got 5 squared times I squared. We just said earlier that I squared is equal to -1. So 5 squared is 25. For I squared, I'm substituting in -1, which would give me -25. I am going to square this one. So that's like saying negative I square root of 2 times negative I square root of 2. I'm going to multiply the insides together and the outsides together. So negative I times negative I would be positive I squared. Square root of 2 times square root of 2, if we took our shortcut, would just be 2. We are allowed to substitute in for the I squared. We can put in -1. So that's what I'm going to do. So -1 times 2 is going to be -2. Let's look at the reflex statement. By definition, I is a square root of -1. Does -1 have another square root? If yes, explain. Okay. So all I would say is that if we looked at this, we know that I equals the square root of -1, meaning that I squared is the same as -1. What would happen if I took the square root of both sides of that? So that, remember, we're supposed to put a plus minus out in front technically. So I equals plus or minus, I know that the square root of -1 is equal to I, right? But it's really plus or minus the square root of -1 is equal to I, but I'm not sure that that almost even makes sense in this case. So let's see what happens when I do the square, or when I square negative I squared, okay? Like that, negative I squared, which would be I times I, which would be, or negative I times negative I, which would be positive I squared. So really it comes out to be the same answer and only has one solution. So I would say no, it only has one solution. And all this mess that we just wrote here, that's our explanation. So now we're going to have you try some. So I would pause the video here and try squaring these things and then come back and look at the answers. I'm going to square both sides. So I end up with negative 2 squared and I squared. Negative 2 squared is 4. We know that we can substitute negative 1 in for I squared. So 4 times negative 1 is negative 4. I'm going to square this, which means I have the square root of 3 over 3i times the square root of 3 over 3i. So square root of 3 times square root of 3 is 3. 3 times 3 is 9, and I times I is I squared. I know that this can reduce to 1/3, and then I squared is the same as negative 1, so I get negative 1/3.